All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kaylee Zazula, and I'm the program manager for Travis Audubon. And I appreciate you all being here this evening for a very interesting presentation with Brian Stokes. I think it was maybe around fall last year that Brian's Grue Jay research started picking up some traction online. And we knew that we had to have Brian talk to us more about this very interesting hybrid. So we'll get to Brian's presentation shortly, but beforehand, I'm just going to give a couple of quick announcements. First of all, you may have heard that we are really trying to push the passing of a bird-friendly building ordinance in Austin. It would be the first major city in Texas to have a building ordinance specifically for helping birds. So we encourage you to sign the petition. Even if you aren't in the city of Austin, we still encourage you to sign the petition. We will show City Council how many people signed the petition in Austin versus the greater Austin area. So we'll link to that in the chat box. That petition also has a little more information on just the process of drafting this ordinance. So we'll link to that. I also want to say that there are Birdathon events happening now. Birdathon started April 1st, and we have a really great lineup of different trips this year. We have a few that are coming up this weekend that still have spots available. So we encourage you to check out our Birdathon events and add to your life list this spring. There's a lot of really cool birds that are migrating through Austin right now. And finally, I want to announce the World Migratory Bird Day event that's happening on May 9th at Hornsby Bend. This is a partnership between Travis Audubon and Austin Waters Center for Environmental Research. And it's going to be a really fun day of birding opportunities. We're going to have lots of partner organizations there talking about the fantastic work that they do to make Austin a more bird-friendly and wildlife-friendly city. And we'll have a really great presentation by Dr. Anderson with Hornsby Bend on just the history of birds and birding there. There should be a lot of really fun stuff happening. So we hope to see you all there. It's a free event, but we encourage people to RSVP just so we know how many people to expect. So that's the end of announcements. We will move on to the reason you're here, the presentation. So I'll start off by introducing Brian. Brian Stokes is a PhD student in integrative biology at the University of Texas at Austin. Originally from Florida, he grew up exploring the wetlands and swamps that sparked his lifelong fascination with birds in the natural world. Before coming to UT, Brian earned his degree in Wildlife Ecology and Conservation from the University of Florida and worked across the country with nonprofits and state and federal agencies on avian research projects. His current work focuses on how birds respond to a changing climate, including a large-scale study of green jay range expansion in South Texas and northeastern Mexico. Brian volunteers in support with Travis Audubon's youth programming. Outside of birds, Brian enjoys swimming and hiking with his family around the Austin area. So I will pass it over to Brian now. Go ahead.
Cool. Hi. Thanks everyone for coming. I hope you guys are having a nice start to migration and have been getting some of the good birds coming through. So today I'll be presenting on this kind of story of this hybrid we recorded between a blue jay and a green jay. This got some press attention last fall. I think some of the actual research that went into it is kind of in the weeds, so I thought this would be a good avenue to explain exactly what we did and how we found this exact species or exact example of interspecies hybridization and the genomics work behind it. And then I want to also discuss the story within the framing of larger scale anthropogenic change happening both locally in Texas and kind of at a larger global scale, and what it tells us about birds at both these scales. And so I think to start off, it's good to touch on the driving theme of the research I do and what is, I think, fair to call the main focus of ornithological research and really broader scale biological research in the 21st century. And so, anthropogenic change or changes driven by human actions are ubiquitous across global environments. And these changes have accompanied the evolution of humans and our unprecedented population growth for the last few millennia. In ecology, we have a term for species that shape or modify or destroy our environments, and these are called ecosystem engineers. And I show this picture of just the US and Canada and Mexico lit up at night, just to see the kind of visual footprint that we have on the landscape around here. And so traditionally, ecosystem engineers are thought of as species like elephants, who shape the vegetative structure of the African savanna, or beavers, who create these complex freshwater ecosystems through the construction and maintenance of their dams that support hundreds of other species. And within this framing, humans are actually, I think, the ultimate ecosystem engineers. And this is often to the detriment of native flora and fauna. This is a random subdivision I found an aerial picture of down in McAllen, Texas. And McAllen, Texas is in the lower Rio Grande Valley. This is a fantastic, fantastic area for birding, one of my favorite areas in the country. And it's an area that's gone through many waves of human engineered land use change, including things like ranching, orchards, and different agricultural pressures. And now this area faces, of course, a new pressure, the rapid threat of suburbanization, as you can see here. And changes to land use can be very visually apparent to people. It's kind of obvious what's going on. And its effects on wildlife are pretty easy to interpret. If a piece of land that used to have a forest or a wetland is turned over to a Walmart or a house, it's not going to support the same level of avian or broader biodiversity that it once would. And so just by looking at this area on this image, we can see that almost no true native habitat remains of what was a small patch of tropical forest historically. But the ways humans shape the environments around us are varied, and our understanding of these changes has actually vastly shifted over the past few centuries. And it came from a spot where we had more direct interactions with wildlife and with our ecosystems to these really indirect and kind of unintended interactions due to our activity. This is a print I like. Well, I don't like it, but I think it's kind of interesting. It's called The Woman Behind the Gun. It's produced by a guy named Gordon Ross back in 1911. And it actually is thought by some, the woman in this image is thought to be Coco Chanel, the fashion designer. The primary, or at least most pressing threat to birds in the early 20th century was really obvious to people. Upwards of 5 million wild birds were harvested each year to support the feather trade in the United States. And this practice was largely stopped by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which prevented the hunting of birds for feathers in the United States. And at the same time these protections were enacted and enforced, broader anthropogenic pressures on avian life were ever increasing in kind of these, again, less obvious and less direct ways. I think it's good to point out Rachel Carson's Silent Spring as at least being partially credited with sparking the modern environmental movement, at least in the West, in the US and Europe during the 20th century. And within this kind of renewed worldview of ecological importance and focus, the broader public began to recognize how human actions were actually affecting the ecosystems around us. And Silent Spring, of course, was one of the key factors leading to the ban of DDT in the United States, which was a super nasty pesticide that had really bad effect on nesting birds, especially groups like eagles, egrets, really anything that was kind of high up the food chain in aquatic ecosystems. But now we have our own set of 21st century anthropogenic issues. And one of the major focuses for the environmentally conscious or aware is that of global climate change. And it seems, at least from my perspective, that humanity is up against a real challenge of stopping this. And people a lot smarter than me have written a bunch about the topic and talked about how people are responding to it. But I think in general, our inability to reverse course in the realm of climate change boils down to these two kind of general issues. One is that the effects of warming are not really acute in a lot of places like America or Europe, and they maybe are acute in many other places across the globe. But these regions are changing in their temperature over the course of a fair number of decades, and so it's actually pretty easy to forget what things might have felt like or been like in prior generations, or what wildlife were around us or plant life was around us 20, 30, 40 years ago when the temperature was maybe more mild. And secondly, and maybe most pressingly, is that our very way of life in America and most parts of the Western world is really intrinsically linked to the production of greenhouse gases at industrial scales. And so I'm not really sure if we as a society are willing to change our lifestyles enough or have the economic or political incentives needed to change how the underlying industries that support these lifestyles function. And thus, this is the stage on which birds must live to fight for survival, at least for the near future until things change in pretty drastic ways. And so I talk about these forms of anthropogenic change and these threats that wildlife are facing because they are really important to animals, and especially birds as well. Changes to the environment are important because each bird species has what we would call a niche. And this broadly defines the conditions that species is able to live in. And it is kind of a simple example I put together that might include relevant factors to a species like our golden cheek warbler. Things like food resources, habitat availability, climate, things like temperature, precipitation, and pressure from predators. And again, with this local example of a golden cheek warbler, a bird that we're pretty familiar with, we can kind of think of this. So these birds are habitat specialists, meaning that they are pretty picky with their habitat they use. They use a very select form of habitat with a mix of juniper and hardwood like oaks that these birds are willing to breed or nest in. In other words, they have a narrow or specialized niche when compared to other species. And it's kind of easy to think of these conditions or these resources around the animal as acting independently on each species, but in reality, the relationships are really, really complex. It could look something like this, and even this is an oversimplification. But each of these factors which affect a species of interest, like our golden cheek warbler, are complexly interconnected such that changes to a single factor may have complex repercussions throughout the local ecosystem of a given species. And significant enough changes to the local climate, like a prolonged drought in the Texas Hill Country, could change the oak and ash juniper habitat which golden cheek warblers need to nest and breed in. And such a drought could also affect the populations of insect food resources like caterpillars and spiders that golden cheek warblers rely on to feed their young. But these effects could also be coupled in more complex ways. A hypothetical drought could decrease regional oak health. And for some reason, this might not immediately affect golden cheek warbler nesting site availability. It might not instantly kill off these oaks, but it could decrease their health in a way that it would affect the food resources that the caterpillars rely on, thereby affecting golden cheek warbler food availability and ultimately affecting the survival and persistence of golden cheek warblers. These types of changes happen at varying temporal and spatial scales, and the interactions also vary in the scales in which they work together. Meaning that species which are going to respond to these changes, like climate change or land use change, have to have the ability to respond to these changes and stressors across different scales. And from the perspective of scientists, it's actually really difficult to understand the exact repercussions that something like climate change might have on a species because these factors are so intrinsically interconnected. And so when confronted with environmental change, species can be thought to have a few broad options. First, they can adapt to these changes, either through more classically thought of evolutionary mechanisms like natural selection or adaptation, or they can utilize what we would consider plasticity or plastic responses, which arise through things like behavioral mechanisms or these kind of fancy, newly understood epigenetic pathways. And as an alternative strategy, species can also just simply move to a new location with more suitable conditions. And finally, those which don't respond to these changes, if they are in fact biologically relevant to this species of interest, via the strategies of adaptation or movement, well, these species simply die out. They just go extinct. And so I present kind of these ideas at the start of this talk as a lens to think about the options species might have to respond to modern day anthropogenic change. The ability of each species to utilize these tools in response to global climate change will determine how each species fares and survives over the next century or two. And so some species are likely to have a greater capacity to respond to rapid change than others. And those which perform worse are likely candidates for population loss, geographic range loss, or in some cases, or extreme cases, extinction. And I really like birds, so I'm rooting for these adaptation or movement options to work together so this is actually specifically what I research at UT. And so I've been studying a local example of a species response to change via movement. And these are also called range shifts, so changes in the geographic range of species. And I look at this through the lens of the green jay in South Texas. So green jays are a super charismatic species, considered a specialty of South Texas. If you haven't gone birding down there, I would highly suggest it. These are a wonderful bird you get to see, and there's about an easy dozen other species that are just awesome to see on any day you can get anywhere in the area. Green jays are really charismatic, and you can see on the right side of the map the birds are found in about 3 disjunct populations. So green jays found in Texas, Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras are comprised of about 5 subspecies. And the image on the left shows the standard plumage morphology we would see in southern Texas and Mexico, north of about Tampico. And so subpopulations south of Tampico or Veracruz area might have more noticeable blue nasal tufts. And as you go even farther south, green jay eye color actually lightens from the dark brown or kind of blackish color we see in Texas and northern Mexico to this really bright, kind of striking yellow color. And the western population near Jalisco and Colima also has some different facial marking. And so the blue spots that are right here around the eye, those are actually kind of a whitish yellow color. Sometimes they have some green mixed in. It sort of, I think, depends on the age of the bird itself. Green jays that live in South America, pictured here, occur largely in lowland elevations of the northern Andes. And so the population in this area is comprised of 6 subspecies. At the moment, ABA considers these 2 separate groups of populations as a single species. But this southern group is often called Inca jays. And this group has its own set of morphological variabilities. But generally, they have this kind of distinct nasal tuft you can see at the front, just behind its bill. And more bright yellow undersides and a bit more of a whitish head. But along with these visual differences, the northern and southern populations are geographically isolated from each other with no evidence of gene flow between the two. So it's there's entire countries separating their ranges. They hang out in fairly different habitat types, and they have a fairly distinct set of behavioral patterns and vocalizations. And I think eventually they would be split into 2 separate species, but you have to actually do like a bunch of genetic analysis to make this happen and go sample genomics from a bunch of these individuals. So eventually I hope someone will do it. I don't really want to do it, but maybe one day one of my colleagues will get it done and be able to separate these into 2 species. And as we all know, Texas is changing rapidly. And this is, of course, occurring both from the perspective of landscape and land use, as well as these large-scale, long-term changes to climate. And I pulled this figure on the left, which just shows the simple temperature trend. So increase in temperature measured in Fahrenheit change per decade within each county in Texas. So the more red you are, the hotter you're getting, and the more blue you are, the cooler you're getting. Now, an interesting thing about this map, there's not any blue on it. It's kind of a bad scale. Really, everywhere in Texas is getting hotter. Some places are getting hotter a little faster than others, but broadly speaking, Texas is warming at a pretty fast rate compared to other places across the globe. And so the important thing to note is that Texas is getting warmer, and as places like Texas warm, species have to respond. So the species that live here show ecological responses. On the right-hand side is a map which shows the changes to the northern range limit of green jay in Texas. And you can see the bottom of the map, this kind of black, thin, dotted line just north of Brownsville, delineates what we would consider the historical northern range boundary of green jays. And so we wouldn't really commonly find green jays north of this line. At least they wouldn't be breeding north of this line. And this is based on historical naturalist records written in the late 1800s and early 1900s, a time when South Texas was just beginning to experience a century of really intense land use and climate changes. But as regions north of this historical range limit changed, whether they warmed or their land use changed, green jay were able to slowly colonize a region which now places their northern range limit 3 degrees of latitude north of their historic distribution, approximately equal to 200 to 250 miles. So it's important to note that changes in climate are likely not the only factor affecting this range expansion. Changes in land cover and land use, as well as supplemental feeding, also play a really strong role in where green jays are able to successfully live and breed in a place like Texas. And while researching information on their historical range, I found this kind of funny bulletin put out by the Smithsonian Museum back in 1946. It included some really early excerpts from biologists with the Bureau of Biological Survey. So this was a precursor to the modern U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The text has some really interesting historical information. If anyone wants a link to it, I'll send it. It has like great. There's one for every bird in the U.S. So they're all funny to read, and they're all kind of in this old timey language. But it's got some great quotes like, "Unluckily for the green jay, his feathers seem to accentuate his sins. Members of this group are no disciples of uprightness. And most relevant to our talk today, I am wondering how much longer this bird of paradise will last. For I've read that huge tractors have been uprooting the forest trees, clearing up the chaparral, and plowing up the rich land to make room for the rapidly growing citrus orchards and other expanding agricultural interests. Thus soon will disappear the only chance we have of preserving on United States soil this unique fauna and flora. And all these interesting birds will have to retreat across the Mexican border, leaving our fauna that much poorer." And so this biologist thought that these land use changes would actually lead to the expatriation of green jay from Texas. But of course, this was a bit of a misprojection of what would happen in the following 80 or so years. But I think it underscores how challenging it can be to predict the biological outcomes of complex anthropogenic change. Even experts are going to get it wrong a lot of the time. And the map I previously showed was a little bit dated. These birds can actually be found in some parts of San Antonio, mostly in the south or south west of San Antonio, and as far east as Victoria, where they're somewhat regular, although there are some seasonal changes to where exactly they're hanging out each year. But while working on this larger project I've been doing with green jay genomics in the state, I was, as many grad students do, quote unquote, working, and I happened to be browsing social media. And I came across a really interesting post on the Facebook group Text Birds that someone was trying to help a landowner in Bexar County figure out what species was shown in this picture. So I saw this kind of grainy picture, and I found the image really intriguing. It didn't look exactly like any birds I was familiar with, but it was blue, like a blue jay or a scrub jay might be. But I did notice this really interesting collar or mantle, this marking that I show here, that looked very similar to the green jays I was used to working with. And so I reached out to the homeowner and asked if I could come and check out the bird in person and potentially do some work on it. And it turns out it actually was a really interesting bird. We were able to capture it using a mist net over the course of about 2 days. It was a bit of a shy bird, and we were able to take a look in the hand to try and figure out what exactly was going on in this bird. And so morphologically, we could see it was a bit of an intermediate between a blue jay shown on the left and a green jay shown on the right. And so this visual evidence was, or based on this visual evidence, it was pretty apparent that the bird was likely a cross between these two species, and it featured a number of intermediate traits. Like I pointed out, this kind of black face marking area, these classic green jay little blue eyebrows, but it had feathers and coloration much similar to the blue jay, and it was interacting with blue jays when we saw it in person. And so we wanted to ensure this identification was correct, so we took a blood sample for later genomic testing. And genomic testing is kind of a lot of work. It's a part of my job that I like the least, doing genetics work. And so we wanted to make sure but we wanted to make sure what we were thinking was correct about who exactly was the parents of this birds. And we were willing to put a fair amount of work into this because we thought it was such an unusual finding. And this is for a few reasons. Firstly was the location. The bird was found just outside of San Antonio near the yellow star on this map on the left. And to make this map, I pulled all the checklists from eBird that were submitted by community scientists like you, and that featured blue jay or green jay in their checklist. And I just placed these on the map as these kind of little colored circles. So blue ones represent blue jays, green ones represent checklists that had a green jay in them. And then the black dots represent a single checklist that featured both species. So within a single person's day birding, maybe an hour or so, they saw both a blue jay and a green jay at the same site. And so we found there were actually a reasonable number of these, but it was about 100 or so checklists up to the year 2023 when we actually captured this hybrid bird. And the commonality of these species interacting had actually increased over time. The right side figure shows the count of the number of checklists, which include both species. The gray bars in the background kind of show the actual total number of checklists each year, which included both species. While the black bar shows the count of checklists with species at a completely new location for the pairing. So the black bar would be just the count of number of spots where a blue jay and green jay were spotted at a spot where both species were not spotted at the same time before. In the early years of this trend were really dominated by vagrancy events, mostly during the late fall and early winter, with very few recorded overlaps during the actual breeding season of the two species, which is about April or May. But as time has gone on, these two species share a much greater area of geographic overlap. Most significantly, Bexar County, where the hybrid bird was actually found, historically did not have either blue jay or green jay. But over time, due to pressures from climate and land use change, both species now overlap in range in a region between about San Antonio and Victoria. And so blue jays have been in the area a little bit longer. They followed pretty closely with Europeans' development in the area, and especially the urbanization and suburbanization of the late 19th and early 20th century. Green jays have only recently pushed so far north, and about 100 years ago, neither species would have been found around San Antonio. And my advisor and I have been interested in this green jay system for a while, and we'd actually been expecting them to make contact with the blue jay at some point, but we did not expect them to interact in a way that might produce a hybrid. We'd assumed the species would be really antagonistic towards one another, as they're generally really territorial, both within their own species and with a few other species around them. And this seemed to be potentially true, at least at the time we thought it was. And we have evidence by the areas where blue jay come into contact with woodhouse scrub jay. The two species seem to have a pretty tight range boundary, potentially limited by each other's species. So blue jays don't push too far into woodhouse scrub jay territory, and scrub jays don't push too far into blue jay territory. And that line is just a little bit west of Austin. Although this might be changing. I just saw local birding expert Jane Tillman actually had a cool picture of a scrub jay at Hornsby Bend, so way east of where they're normally found. This was like just the other week I saw on eBirds. That was very cool. A great find by Jane. But even if these two species, like the blue jay and the green jay, acted quote unquote friendly with another, we also couldn't have imagined the two species would have the ability to produce a viable offspring, as they're separated by an evolutionary gap estimated to be about 7.5 to a million years, which is a very long time of divergence to produce a hybrid. And so, despite our surprise, we took on the work to confirm this hybrid via genetic methods. And I'll walk us through what we actually did. We'll have to go back to some, high school and college biology stuff. I hope this isn't too in the weeds for people. And so if you remember from your biology classes, you know that the genome of animals and plants is comprised by a number of individual chromosomes. And so each chromosome is made of these really long strands of DNA molecules, and these are formed by connected strands of nucleotides. And each nucleotide has a component called the nitrogenous base. These bases are adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine, and they're represented by the classic letters A, G, T, and C. And so you get these really complex patterns of these bases or these letters that store genetic information, and they're unique to each individual in each species. And so each organism has its own unique genetic code formed by these DNA molecules. Different species have different genetic patterns, and more closely related species will have more similar patterns to each other. And again, while distantly related species have more distant genetic patterns. And so we actually use this to our advantage to compare the DNA of individuals, like the hybrid we found, with the genetic patterns stored in public repositories of DNA to figure out which species are most genetically similar. So we kind of do the old, who's the parent thing on an older TV show. I'm blanking on the name right now. And so we actually use this algorithm called BLAST that's made to compare small sections of DNA together to see what are the most similar. And so we compare the little section of DNA that we collected in the wild from this hybrid with the full genomes of a bunch of other species of birds. And when we actually sequence DNA in a laboratory, we don't get the full length of the entire chromosomes. That's really, really hard to do and really expensive. Rather, we receive these really short chunks of DNA that are stored as computer code. And so, depending on the actual methodology, it's often between about 100 to 400 letters long, or nucleotides long. And so, we end up with thousands or even millions of these little chunks of DNA from each sample that we store on the computer, and then we compare against the full DNA strand of a known species. So we use this BLAST algorithm to compare these sections to the full-length genomes of known species to figure out which are actually the most similar to the sections that we collected in the wild. We found out that about half the DNA we collected from this hybrid individual matched most closely with that of the genome of green jay, which is shown in the green bar on the left here. And about half matched closely with blue jay, Steller's jay, or was tied between the two species. And blue jay and Steller's jay are really closely related. They actually share a lot of sections of DNA, so the algorithm wasn't able to figure out exactly which one was the parent in certain cases, or which one was most likely the parental species. But the majority, C. cristata, did line up with blue jay, whereas only a small section, about 20%, lined up with Steller's jay. But again, about 50% of our DNA lined up with green jay, about 50% lined up with someone from the Cynocitta group, which is the genus that includes blue jay and green jay. And so with about half of our sample showing similar to both of these species, the line of evidence really strongly indicated the blood sample we collected may be from a hybrid between the two species, but because these results were murky, we had to check a few other tests. And so in sexually reproducing species like birds, DNA is passed from parent to offspring through the species' set of chromosomes. So each species has its own specific number of chromosomes. For example, humans have, what do we have? Is it 46? I'm going to get in trouble with my high school biology teacher, but something like that. We have a specific number and every human has the same one. And a haploid sperm and a haploid egg each carry a single copy of each chromosome. So normally we have pairs, we have duplicates of each chromosome, one from the mother and one from the father. When a sperm and an egg cell fuse together, they create a zygote. This is a new cell where if everything works properly, each maternal chromosome has a fraternal counterpart. These paired chromosomes code for approximately the same general genetic processes or information, but might be slightly different as individuals go. And we call the actual locations on each chromosome that performs about the same process or duties as homologous. And so these can be, there can be homologous chromosomes or even homologous positions. And maternal and fraternal homologous positions can be identical or different from each other. So they can be really similar in their actual genetic coding, or they can be different, but they still perform the same basic function. And this is why there's this distinction you might have heard between heterozygous and homozygous genes. So heterozygous genes are homologous genes where the maternal and the fraternal chromosome differ in their genetic coding. Homozygous genes are ones where the fraternal and the maternal chromosome are the exact same genetic coding. So it would have the same base pairs, the same letters for all the spots that code for interesting stuff. And so we filtered our genetic data to find all available homologous positions between the full green jay genome and the full blue jay genome that were heterozygous. So spots where blue jay is different from green jay at the same position. And a hybrid has the same set of homologous positions. At these positions, we would expect this hybrid to have one gene that matches the blue jay and one gene that matches a green jay. And so we calculate the average identity of each of these positions and found out that the hybrid we had did in fact have the exact genetic makeup we would expect for a first generation hybrid between a blue jay. So every spot that was homologous or that was homologous between the mother and the father was exactly heterozygous between the two. Invertebrates like birds have a second source of genetic information aside from the traditional nuclear DNA we think of in our chromosomes. Within each cell, we actually have small organelles called mitochondria. You might have remembered this from educational programming that would call it the powerhouse of the cell. But each mitochondria actually has its own DNA strand. And these organelles are able to actually self-replicate independently via division. So they actually aren't involved in our nuclear DNA process at all. But the DNA inside of mitochondria is about 16,000 bases long, which is quite short. Our actual chromosomes are around like 55 to 100 billion bases long. So these are really, really short little chunks of DNA. But they're unique to each species, but really slowly evolving. Because mitochondria does such important functions, there's not a lot of change between species. So they're considered really good to identify species. They're not considered very good to identify individuals. And like almost every cell, both the egg cell and sperm cell contain these mitochondria. The zygote, which is formed when a sperm cell and an egg cell fuse, also contains mitochondria. But interestingly enough, the zygotic mitochondria is not equally inherited from sperm and egg. Almost 100% of the mitochondria in a zygote is directly inherited from the egg cell, with very, very little coming from the sperm cell, if any at all. Meaning that if we compare the mitochondrial DNA of the hybrid we captured to that of these two possible parent species' mitochondrial DNA, we can actually tell exactly which species is the mother. And so that's what we did. Here we show letters which represent a small section of the mitochondrial DNA of our hybrid up at the top, labeled as hybrid MT. This is about 50 bases long, and using the same algorithm as shown before, we can compare the mitochondrial DNA of the hybrid to that of a green jay, a blue jay, a Steller's jay, which was one of our candidate species, and then we also used a comparative outgroup, the Eurasian magpie, labeled as P. pica. We found that the mitochondrial DNA of the hybrid very closely matched the pattern found in the mitochondrial DNA of the green jay sample, meaning the hybrid was the resultant of the mating between a female green jay and a male blue jay. So we confirmed that, we knocked it out, we finished that part. And so you might be actually asking yourself, what actually is a hybrid? Is this common among birds? And so I put together some additional research on the topic because I wasn't super sure about this either. And I found out you have to specify the term biology when you Google this. You can't just type hybrid. You have to say hybrid biology, and then you'll figure out what we're actually talking about. And so hybridization is really common in biology. Some examples include things like the mule, which is a hybrid between a horse and a donkey. A lot of common agricultural crops like the peanut. This is a hybrid between a few wild groundnut plants found in South America. And in fact, a huge proportion of the crops we consume for food are the result of hybrid breeding programs, whether purposeful or accidental. And finally, of course, another great example is Homo sapiens. Those of our species which share similar ancestry to the odd-looking young man on the right-hand side likely contain between about 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA, a completely different species than our own species, Homo sapiens. But due to extensive hybridization millennia ago, this Neanderthal DNA has actually carried forward in modern Homo sapiens. And almost all Homo sapiens that are not of African descent contain Neanderthal DNA. And hybridization is really, really common in birds. It's thought that about 16% of all wild bird species are known to hybridize. Some classic examples just in the US include the Lawrence's warbler, a cross between a blue-winged warbler and a golden-winged warbler. If you get very lucky on the coast this year, you might be able to see one of these. I have not gotten a Lawrence's warbler, but they do pop up in Texas a few times each year. Bullocks and Baltimore oriole hybrids. In our own backyard, the tufted titmouse and black-crested titmouse readily hybridize. This is a great picture by the local fantastic birder Rich. who is able to tell these apart. I cannot tell which ones are hybrids and which ones are just black crested titmice. I think you have to have a better eye than I do. Uh, but birds like New World warblers, waterfowl, hummingbirds, and gulls all frequently hybridize. And generally, species are thought to have a set of quote unquote barriers which should present breeding with other species. But in birds, these seem to often break down for a number of odd reasons. We call this set of conditions which limit hybridization before fertilization of the egg pre-zygotic barriers. And these would include things like geographic or habitat isolations, so animals breeding in different locations or habitats that just don't have the chance to mate with each other. Temporal isolations, which is where animals breed at different times, whether that's time of day or time of year, they're just not synced up in that cycle. Or behavioral isolation mechanisms, where behavioral traits like courtship or mating signals lead to incompatibility. And these mechanisms likely play a fairly significant role in preventing the hybridization within most bird species. But many species breed at about the same time, and many species breed in about the same place and have a lot of overlap geographically with closely related species within the same genus. And so finally, bird behavior is also quite flexible, at least in some groups. And so it's possible that birds are willing to respond to or attracted to these novel signals produced by not exactly their same species, but a new individual of a similar species they ran into. There's also a set of post-zygotic barriers which exist, which prevent the development of hybrid zygotes, so post-fertilization zygotes, into healthy adults. And often this results from genes from the mother and father interacting in poor or unexpected ways. And birds actually have what we would call well-conserved genomes, where the mother, or well-conserved genomes, meaning they feature a lot less change over time in between species. So the actual arrangement of chromosomes between most bird species is really similar. There's only a few groups of bird species that have really wonky chromosomal arrangements, whereas something like humans and chimpanzees, even though we're very closely related, have completely different chromosomal arrangements. So this high level of chromosomal conservation between species might act as a mechanism that allows for more hybridization than we would expect in groups that are equally diverged, like mammals or reptiles or some fish. And so it makes sense that there are actually some regions where hybridization is really common. Many species pairs actually produce these stable hybrid zones. And so they're often where two closely related species ranges butt up right against each other. And this is the case of the previously mentioned oriole and titmouse examples. This image shows the area where you can find hybrids between the bullocks on the west and the Baltimore oriole on the east. It's mostly in this Great Plains area where the two individuals' ranges overlap. This is actually data produced by folks at Cornell based on eBird data during the breeding season, showing where these species are found. And the yellow color shows where the hybrids are likely to be found. So really cool use of community science data. Hybrid zones have actually been shown to also be mediated by climate. The hybrid zone between black-capped chickadee and Carolina chickadee occurs in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and it's been tracked for about 25 years. And slowly, this has actually marched northward as the region has warmed, allowing the less cold-adapted Carolina chickadee to push its range northward. And these hybrids between the two species have actually been shown to have lower fitness than either parent species. They produce what's called an intermediate song, so a song that's kind of between both parent species, and it actually leads to lower reproductive success than either of the pure parent species. And so it kind of maintains the species boundary between the two individuals where the hybrids don't do as well. They can't produce or reproduce as readily as a full-blooded black-capped chickadee or a full-blooded Carolina chickadee. And so this is a great way to track the exact range boundaries of the two species as the region warms. But this brings us back to the case of the blue jay and green jay hybridization. These species now have a thin range of overlap on the Texas Gulf Coast. So do we expect them to produce a stable hybrid zone? Well, probably not. Their behavioral differences are likely too great to lead to a high number of hybridization events. These birds just act really different and they look really different. Most of the stable hybrid zones have birds that act pretty similar and look just about the same, but you could show these birds to anyone on the street and they'd say they're two different species. But most likely the case that we found was what we might have called a relaxed assertive mating situation. And so in normal conditions, when a green jay has many options for mating, they'll prefer to use what's called assortive mating. This means that they select mates of the same species. But in potentially more limited conditions, like what could have happened here, the strategy relaxes. And so instead of foregoing the opportunity to mate with a conspecific with another green jay, they'll often just take a lesser or lower choice option. And we showed that our hybridization was the case of a female green jay mating with a male blue jay. And so we could theorize that potentially this female green jay ended up much farther north than other green jay in Texas. And so when spring came, she made the best of a bad situation and decided to mate with a, kind of lower quality from her eyes blue jay male. These birds, and what's interesting is these birds actually have kind of different incubation strategies and parental responsibilities. Male green jays are much, much more involved with incubation and food provisioning during nesting than blue jays are. And so I don't really know exactly what was going on within the arrangement these two birds have, but I would guess the green jay mother must have thought that the blue jay mate she selected was a bit lazy or kind of a bum or something because he wasn't bringing as much food as a normal green jay mate might have brought in a normal situation. So, but somehow she forged on and was able to actually raise this healthy hybrid baby. And so what? I want to bring us back to kind of the broader picture here. I have 3 points. So first off, it was interesting because in the context of range expansion, and a similar cross was actually produced in captivity at the Fort Worth Zoo back in the 60s. In a report about this bird, the authors wrote, the possibility of the green jay and blue jay occurring naturally together during the breeding season is remote, so that hybrids are not expected in the wild. But now, due to the effects of range expansions brought on by climate change and land use change, these species do regularly interact within a limited region between San Antonio and the Gulf Coast. Second, climate change has really unpredictable outcomes. Again, like I said, my advisor and I have been studying the system for a while, and we had been wondering what would happen when these species came into contact. We knew they eventually would, but were completely wrong about what we would expect. We thought they would establish a really clear range boundary between each other due to the interspecies antagonism, or fighting between the two species. And we never would have guessed that they would have had the potential to mate, especially considering their evolutionary divergence spans between 7 to 11 million years apart. And so there's likely other species that are, primed to expand their range or change where they're living and eventually come into contact with other species which they can readily hybridize with or are more closely related than the green jay and blue jay are in our situation. So this is an ongoing trend that I think is going to be happening globally and might have really interesting effects for global biodiversity. And finally, I think most importantly, community science is crucial for ornithology research. This bird was discovered by an amateur naturalist. This was not something that I went out and found. This person was not a trained research scientist or a paid ornithologist or even really a super involved birder. They were just a person that hangs out in their backyard and sometimes looks at the birds that come to the bird box they have or the bird feeder they have. And so I really believe that people of really any level or knowledge or birding experience can play an important role in shaping the future of ornithological or even environmental research. For us to understand the wide scope of what's happening in our world, we really need people to keep being involved in community science efforts like eBird, iNaturalist, backyard bird counts, Christmas bird counts, really anything you can do around you to keep attention to the natural world and keep tabs on what's going on in your area that you live in. This is especially true in places like Texas, where so much of our land is privately owned and managed. We need landowners to stay connected to their land to be able to understand what changes occur as they happen. Our state actually sits at the crossroads of northern temperate and southern tropical ecosystems, and it's split with humid eastern and dry western climates. And so I expect the changes of climate change to have really pronounced effect on our native flora and fauna. And frankly, paid scientists, people like Texas Parks and Wildlife, the federal biologists that we have in our state, there's just not enough people to track what's actually going on. We really need engaged community scientists, people that keep going on eBird and go on iNaturalist and are master naturalists that have a good eye on what's going on. I think is going to be really critical towards whether or not we're able to fully pay attention to what actually is going on in our state over the next 50, 60, 100 years. And so with that being said, I'd like to say thank you for my friends at Travis Audubon for having me to speak today. My co-author and advisor, Tim, as well as the members of the Digital Ecology Laboratory. We have project funding partners shown here. And then this is Miss Donna, who was most crucially the community scientist who discovered this hybrid bird. She named it Henry. It's called the Grue Jay, but out of respect for Miss Donna, I usually do call it Henry. So again, thanks so much for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions or whatever we've got. And I'll go to a nice picture for us to hold on.
Thank you so much, Brian. While we wait for some questions to roll in, I have a question that we can kick off with. So you mentioned that hybrids typically have lower reproductive fitness than their parent species. Do we know how hybridization typically affects just the overall health of those individuals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I should be specific. That's true in mostly vertebrates and things like plants. It's actually kind of good to be a hybrid. So like corn is a hybrid. Like all these different plants are hybrids and do really, really well. And there's all sorts of complex reasons for that that I don't really understand. But for vertebrates, um, being a hybrid, if your parents are far enough apart, can have benefits and can have negative consequences. It can be a really mixed bag. Long term, evolutionarily, what matters is the hybrid able to reproduce? So is it able to pass on its genetic material? And we're unsure if this individual got the chance to or tried to. The last time we had an image of it, it was by then 4 years old. So when we actually captured it, it was about 1.5 years old, and that was back in 2023. And Miss Donna actually sent me a picture of it late last summer. It was just hanging out in her yard and had been gone for like 2 years by then. Like she just hadn't seen it. It was like, oh, it just popped back in. So it is out in the wild. It is seemingly reasonably healthy. 4 years is an okay lifespan for a jay. They usually, if they're really healthy, can live probably 4 to 7 years is reasonable to expect. Some will live a little bit longer than that. Um, but I have no doubt the bird is at least trying to mate while he's off of Donna's property. I think out of respect he wouldn't do courtship in front of her, but who knows?
Very cool. Are there any theories about why birds have such high genome conservation?
No, it's really not understood. I have heard the theory that being a bird is really complex compared to being something like a plant. And this is like, I don't know if this is correct or true. This is kind of out there. But the margins with which your genome has to perform correctly as a bird could potentially be a little bit tighter than what it would need to be if you were, say, a dandelion, which those regularly hybridize, regularly have really interesting mutations happen with their chromosomes, and things like dandelions or plants do totally fine with it. And so that could be part of it. It still doesn't explain the big difference between things like birds and mammals, because being a mammal is also complex. Maybe mammals outside of bats don't fly. There have been some hypotheses linked to flight. I don't think those really hold up because bats have pretty mixed chromosomal arrangements, and the same is true of insects. Although insects have their own weird genetic stuff going on, so it's really not understood. I don't know if there's like a way to answer that question ever. That's kind of one of the weird mysteries of genomics or evolution or ornithology that I don't think we'll get a good answer on.
Right. And do ornithologists use iNaturalist and eBird pretty equally, or do they favor one over the other when using it for research purposes?
Yeah, it depends on goals. I would say eBird is considered about the gold standard of a community science survey. And so it's really a really powerful tool for us because not just there's so many people involved in doing eBird, eBird has built into it it's built like a survey. And so a survey gives us information about how much effort people were going out and birding. And so when you actually fill out an eBird checklist, it times you and it follows the amount of area you go along through your GPS. And there's actually individual records assigned to each person. So eBird actually knows if someone is a good birder or a bad birder. There's these kind of background metrics that you don't see unless you are downloading the research data. And so eBird has lots of ways to figure out, are people seeing and reporting the correct bird? Are they likely to be correct? Are they likely to be getting all the birds that they might be seeing in an area? And so they have this background, what we would call observational process, that tells us about what's actually going on behind the scenes when someone goes out and reports an eBird list. And so we kind of have like a lot of information showing us what people are actually doing. Whereas iNaturalist is a really cool resource, especially for non-birds. You can't really submit non-birds on eBird that easily, and so they give us great information about where things are happening. But we would use the term opportunistic sampling when people go out on iNaturalist because we don't actually know about how much effort they went in. I go on iNaturalist all the time because I use that Seek app on my phone because I'll see a bug or a plant and I'll be like, what is that? And so I can submit that and it might give me a correct locality and time that I saw an animal or a plant, but it doesn't really tell me about what I was doing out in the field that day. Was I submitting? Was I looking really hard for rare species? Did I pick that species because it was the brightest flower in the patch of flowers I was at? And so eBird comes with this really, really rich set of information that when you fill out an eBird report, you don't actually see, that is invaluable to ornithologists. And I think is key to why eBird is so useful and so important to research that's actually going on right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, I also have used eBird data for like scientific research purposes or research paper purposes, and yeah, it's really cool. I can't overemphasize how important eBird is to ornithologists, and that like people who are casual birders, like if you're submitting eBird data, you're making a difference to like ornithological research. So yeah.
Yeah, every checklist is helpful. Like they're all
Mhm.
so valuable. It's actually crazy. I would not have a job without eBird, so I do like when people do it. But also for broader scale bird conservation, it's just so important.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we have another question. I'm guessing if Henry mated with a green jay, the offspring would look more like a green jay. And if you mated with a blue jay, it would look more like a blue jay. So basically, maybe we wouldn't notice that the offspring were hybrid. Am I
Hmm.
understanding that correctly? Okay,
That
I think I
that's a
understand
great
the question
question.
now.
Yeah, I think that brings in an interesting point I didn't really bring up. And so, um, this bird in the middle, the hybrid Henry, does sort of look like a blue jay. If you're not a person who's really looking at blue jays all that often, or is just really quickly glancing, you might not actually have noticed it was a hybrid. And that
Mhm.
is certainly the case of what's going on. This bird's in a pretty suburban area outside of San Antonio. It was found on a suburban property. This was not a remote ranch or anything. And so even the perfect 50-50 hybrid between the two wasn't that noticeable. It's only been, to my knowledge, reported by a single person over 4 years within one of the most populous counties in Texas. And so it's leaving her property and going undetected, likely just to other people's houses to hang out or patches of woodlands or park in this very populated area. And so it's totally possible there were other hybrids from the same nest. It's totally possible he has successfully produced hybrids of his own that we wouldn't really notice. There's really no way of knowing what's going on. I will say when we went out and trapped him, that was in very early June, and so the majority of jays will have mated, but some will still be mating late. And he looked like he was trying to interact with blue jays, so he at least is trying to socially integrate, or was trying to socially integrate with blue jay flocks. I have no idea if he was successful or not. There's really no way to know, but it at least he was probably trying. So if there was a blue jay who was lonely enough on a the right night, maybe they were had a nice time together or something.
Yeah, that is very interesting to think about what is it Henry or Harry? What Henry's offspring would look like.
I think it was Henry. Yeah, yeah.
Great. I think that wraps up the questions, but Brian, this has been really interesting and we appreciate having you talk to us this evening about hybrids.
Yeah, thank you so much. If anyone has questions, just reach out to me. I'm happy to answer via email or whatever. Any hybrid questions or J questions people have.
Excellent. Well, getting a lot of great feedback. So again, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here this evening. This is our last speaker presentation of the spring. Next month, we'll be having our annual business meeting. We'll have more information on the calendar about that soon. But I wish you all a wonderful rest of your week. Go out and see some amazing birds. Spring migration is fully underway, and especially after the storms we got, there's some really cool stuff to see. So have a wonderful evening, everyone.